Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Fantasy Writing Tips, hosted by me, Jan Blute, at Mystical Realms Faire, where I am positive you are having a fantastic time. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy. Now, first off, before we go into the experience that I want to share and information that you might be able to use with your fantasy stories, I kind of want to explain where I got all of that. So first off, I have a bachelor's degree in creative writing, so it's a lot of workshopping and talking about different people's ideas and getting all of that information, as well as just so much reading. It was a wonderful time. And on top of that, I am a panel host generally, and at first it was in New England conventions, but as we have gone remote, I have been able to have the very high honor of hosting panels online as well, which means the more the merrier. And I am a huge dork, so I've read tons of fantasy books. I've played fantasy games and watched all kinds of anime. So there's a lot of experience as a reader and as a professional. So I'm happy to bring that and share it with you. A quick breakdown of what we're going to be going over here so you have an idea of what we're looking at. We have the index outlining the setting, because that's your first thing. That's what your world is based in, so it's kind of a big deal. And magic, where if you don't have magic in your fantasy story, odds are there's some sort of supernatural element, a fictional aspect to it that's not a real world equivalent of, and the same rules will generally apply to that as they would to magic. Building your party, so you want to look at your characters, main and supporting, and see if they are a good fit for what you're doing. And then fantasy dialogue, because it is a little different. I will cover the basics of dialogue as well, but go into specifically what's different with fantasy anime. Fantasy dialogue that you would really want to look at. So, going right into it. Setting, your breakdown is naming things, the history and culture of the place that you're in, and exposition of your setting, which is essential for fantasy, but of course very difficult to do. So, bare bones first, naming things. I know this probably seems very basic, but it's something that is very important. Think of Legend of Zelda as an example. You've got the Triforce. You had to pick which one they were the Triforces of. There was Hyrule. Who are the residents of Hyrule? Are they Hylians? Hyruleans? You have to decide. And you have to stick with it, whole story long. So you've got to get yourself a story Bible ASAP. Just so you can stick to it and make sure it's all called the same thing by the same people. Using Hyrule as an example, it would make sense for the people of Hyrule to call themselves Hylians, and perhaps outsiders calling them Hyruleans because they don't follow the same naming structure. It's possible. So that's the sort of thing that you want to think about. Using some real-world examples, because of course life imitates art, vice versa, we're going to go into that first. My personal favorite is things like Main Street, 30 Years' War. Human beings are going to sometimes name things exactly what they are. So if you're worried about something, calling it the hero's sword or something, don't be. Because sometimes people just call it what it is. It doesn't have to be Excalibur. It can just be the hero's sword. Whichever one works better for your story, your audience, and for you writing it. Because if you don't enjoy writing it, everyone's going to know. So if it makes you happier and it works for your story, by all means, human beings are like that. Another example I wanted to bring up was Berenice, 1st through 4th of ancient Egypt. You look at that name, you hear how it's pronounced, and you don't think Egyptian necessarily. And that's important to mention, because it's not Egyptian. It's got more of a Greek origin than an Egyptian origin. The reason for this being is this is when the Cleopatra was during her prime. So Egypt and Greece were still on loosely speaking terms. Their relationship is rocky. We're not going into the history of that. But the point is, it would make sense for an Egyptian leader to have a Greek name, considering that connection. They are discussing all the time. Their culture is always exchanging. They're shaping one another. So it would make sense for them to have a vaguely Greek name. keep that in mind with your stories as well. If there's two cultures that interact often, it wouldn't be surprising if those things mixed. If you have one person from a different region who has a name that's not like anyone else's in the region, as long as there's a reason for that, you're okay. You're all right. Important to keep in mind, though. And the third one, going more into the cultural melding, is more important on the end of translation, of how words transition from one language to another. If you're very much into fantasy languages and making up your own languages, that's where this is really going to become important. It's also a useful tool for those of you who don't want to make your own language to kind of imply the existence of other languages, but not going into the rules and mechanics of it. If you're not Tolkien and you're not into that, it's just too much for you to really enjoy it, this is another great way to go about it. So the reason I pull non-bread and chai tea as an examples is that in their native languages, non means bread and chai means tea. The origins of those words in our language. So it's essentially bread, and tea, tea. But because we are talking about a specific type of bread in our culture here in America, it becomes non-bread and chai tea. Because there's multiple kinds of tea. Even downstairs I've got East Asian teas and European teas. I need to specify. So I can't just say chai. I could. But calling it chai tea is not unheard of. And similarly, if you translate something like sliced bread into other languages, occasionally it comes out as bread, because they don't have sliced bread there. It's something we made. Rather, we have. I don't know the origins of sliced bread. Something we have, and that they don't generally have, so they need to distinguish it on their end. This is an unusual type of bread to them, and it becomes bread on their end. So when you're looking at how language interacts with other language, keep in mind this is something that could happen in your story. And it's a great way to imply the existence of other languages without actually having to generate all of the words and all the letters and the translations and the conjugations, if that's not something you want to do, ever. You can dodge it by having interactions of language like this. They're not always duplicated like this. It's just kind of one example. And of course, it wouldn't be a fantasy writing panel if I didn't go into fictional examples. So we have here Morningstar, the weapon of Trevor Belmont, in Netflix's Castlevania. Now, people who have kept up with Castlevania and know the Belmonts hear Morningstar and know it is a sacred weapon made to defeat cursed creatures. But if you just said Morningstar is a weapon, and you didn't know it was Castlevania, it may not be your first guess. So this is something to keep in mind. Context is important. Operate within the context of your story, and you get names that make sense to the people who have been following it all along. It may not make sense to people outside, without any context, but once they have the context, they'll understand. I mean, it's obviously not a Sailor Moon weapon when you see it with Trevor Belmont. Another important thing here is anagrams and moving things around with names. Granted, this is something that has been going on forever. So things like Alucard would probably seem a little cheesy to this modern audience, just a little bit, because it's already been done a lot, where you just make the name backwards. But depending again on your audience, this is something they may not notice right away, or could be a very good hint. Feel free to play with it. Just because it's something that has happened before doesn't mean you can never, ever do it again. We would run out of stories very, very quickly if that were the case. And you have things like Voldemort with the scramble of letters. It's another option you can do. This one is a lot harder because obviously you are restricted to the letters that you have. And it could be a hindsight sort of situation. We don't know. So those are the sorts of things you want to keep in mind when you can play with names like that. It's a very fantasy sort of trope. And kind of fun. And all of Final Fantasy. Just all of it. One of the tropes that is my favorite, casually referred to as Aerith and Bob, is the fact that names are just sometimes all over the grid. There's literally Aerith, and then like Sid. But then also Cloud, named after a formation of moisture. Like we don't know who comes from the same place as Tifa. They lived in the same village, and it's Cloud and Tifa. You're like, okay, whatever you say. And sometimes that's just how it is. So when you're looking at naming things, know your audience and know what they'll accept. It's called a willing suspension of disbelief for a reason. Some audiences are more willing to not be skeptical of Cloud and Tifa coming from the same village, just because it doesn't really impact the story all that much. It's not like them having names that don't necessarily sound alike is going to ruin the entire game experience. It's not going to happen. So they're okay with it. They will suspend that disbelief. Keeping those things in mind when you're giving characters names. And also name meaning, being ironic or things like that. Hence Mai from Avatar: The Last Airbender, because her name means smile, and that's her charming smile. There she is, being dead serious all of the time. 24/7. 365. Constant. So you can give characters names meaning and choose it based on their meaning and kind of be tongue-in-cheek about it, or you could be very literal about it. It's up to you. But make sure you're making that decision consciously. If you're going to go with name meaning, don't just be like, I like this name meaning, but it has nothing to do with this character. If you're going by meaning. I wouldn't say you have to look up characters' names' meanings just to make sure it makes sense with their character. Either go in on that or don't. Because it happens more than once in Avatar: The Last Airbender. It doesn't happen to all the characters, but it does happen more than once. So keep it in mind. You can do it with only supporting characters like Mai, or you could do it with all your main characters, but make sure you kind of have a plan going into that. If you are not looking at meaning at all, there's no need to. If you're looking to meaning to one person, I would add in a few others as well, just to kind of make it more of an Easter egg and less of a one-off. My personal opinion. I think it's more effective that way. I will also specify that writing is an art, not a science. So if you have two characters whose names have ironic meanings or symbolic meanings, and not three, it's not the end of the universe. It all depends on the execution in your story. So keep that in mind. Alright, and now this is what I have called the knowledge tiers. This is something that I do. I don't know if other writers use it or not, but it's something that I like to keep in mind, particularly with worlds that you're creating as you go. The author will know the most. You are the source of all knowledge in this world. You have a stupid level of information on the people, on the setting, everything. You know everyone's favorite color, you know their favorite foods, you know the scents they like, you know the time of day they like to wake up. You don't need to give all of this information to the audience. It's just not necessary. And the characters might not have all of this information either. So these two, the characters and audience, will swap roles. So think of it like as a horror movie, for example. The monster goes down the hallway. The audience knows this. Then someone turns the corner and goes, Sally, is that you? The audience knows it's not Sally, but the character not knowing whether or not it's Sally is what makes the moment suspenseful. So that's how you would use these kinds of tiers. In fantasy, the main obstacle is making sure you don't give too much information to either party. If the character knows something and then acts as if they don't, it's a little weird. If the audience knows something and then you as the writer act like they don't, it's also weird. So it's important to keep in mind who knows what. And that's something you can also keep a character profile for on your own reference, just in your own writing files, to say who knows what about who and where and all of that. Very important to keep in mind with worlds that you're still exploring, especially if you're going to be kind of doing a plot twist halfway through or anything like that, any mystery sort of suspenseful thing. Especially with that, it's important. So keep your knowledge tiers in mind, and remember, you don't have to share all of your knowledge. That is also very important. A lot of writers feel like if they put a bunch of work into setting up a world, they have to give every single piece of information that they have into their story. You don't have to. Only the information that makes the story effective. So, no one needs to know the diet of the fictional horse-esque creature you created. No one needs to know anything about that. Is it an undead horse? No one knows. No one has to, necessarily, unless it is relevant to the plot. So don't spend too much time on things that aren't going to enhance the story. Other things that I could mention here, I would say Comedic Relief is in its own category. Think of the cabbage cart guy in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He's there constantly. He just shows up in the background to scream "my cabbages" at important moments. He's a through line, and we don't know why he's everywhere, but we don't need a reason because he's just for fun. So this is something you can use that, yes, technically isn't plot relevant, but it's kind of tone relevant. So, as long as it has a use in your story, keep it. But if it doesn't have an application, if it's not doing anything for the audience, take it out. And that's kind of to the rule of writers that's very important and very hard for a lot of us, is kill your darlings, is what it is called. So there will be something that an author just loves. They are just smitten with it. But it doesn't actually do anything for the story, for the characters, for the people reading it. Sometimes you have to kill your darlings. No matter how much you love it, you're going to have to scrap that idea. Alright, and now we're going into more of exposition. Speaking of information that you have that maybe you should or should not share. We will find out. This is essential in fantasy, but it has to feel natural. I would say the number one problem I ran into workshops were people who were writers having characters explain things to one another that both of them already knew. So it would be like me explaining in very specific detail where the grocery store is in relation to my house to my girlfriend living with me. Like, she also knows. She's been to the grocery store. Like, there's no reason for me to be that specific explaining to her. Unless it's the writer speaking through the character to the audience. And then it feels unnatural. You're reminding them of the fourth wall. And not in a fun, The Office kind of way. In a way that is kind of uncomfortable because they're trying to immerse themselves in this reality and you're pulling them out of it to let them know that you're there. You're making your presence too known when you do something like that. So, the reason I have this picture here with Gandalf in one of the Hobbit houses is if this were written out, and of course, obviously, it was at one point, but I'm not going to give you a screenshot of that. When you write this out, it'll explain his height in relation to the height of the buildings. So you have this knowledge now that he is taller than the hobbits. Drastically. He can just touch the ceiling. In fact, he looks a little cramped in there. So, just describing him going through this house gives the reader information about the hobbits' houses, his height in relation to their height, that his height is normal and their height is normal. It's that he is in their home that's making this so apparent. And readers don't exist in vacuums. They can intuit this themselves. When he's ducking to get through doorways and touching his hand against the ceiling, they get the idea that this house was made by short people for short people, and he's just very tall in relation to their average height. One example I've given here with a quote from a game that my friends are sick of hearing about, Fire Emblem Three Houses, will explain how you can have two characters talk about something that they both know and have it feel natural. The way you would carry something like that out is an acknowledgement when they're both processing something they both know already. So we have, this is a quote from Hubert von Vestra talking to Petra McNeary. It is not a huge spoiler, it is something that comes up very, very early. And doesn't get addressed super often, it's a backstory kind of thing. So, Hubert says to her, "While you were called our guest, you were actually a hostage. You were meant to be insurance that Brigid would not restore its alliance with Dagda and attack us. The Empire required leverage, and after all, you are the Princess of Brigid." So, this is him acknowledging the history that she experienced. She was very young when this happened, and so was he. They're about the same age. So, it's kind of processing that experience together, where she seemed very afraid when she came over, and he offered to help. This is more context than you're getting in this quote, of course, But this quote makes sense in a discussion where he's almost reassuring her that she fits now, that she was a hostage at first, used as insurance to keep Bridget from attacking their country again, but she's kind of become one of them. Hence, you can tell they're talking casually about it. This is not a spiteful thing that's being said here. So it does kind of shed light on how their relationship began to where it is now, and it feels natural to do it. Them talking about how she even got to where she is now. I mean, she started off in her home country, was brought to their home country, and now she's in a totally different place. So she's gone a long way, and it's something that would make sense for them to talk about. And to talk about like this. He didn't explain to her where Bridget is in relation to Dagda, like she knows. She lived there. And this game, it got the award for excellence at the Japan Game Awards in 2020, the Game Award for Best Strategy Game 2019, Player's Voice Award at the Game Awards in 2019. It has a lot going for it. So this kind of dialogue is still talking about things that both characters know, but in a way that makes sense for them to discuss. It's not me explaining how to brush your teeth to someone who's the same age as me. That dissonance is where you'll feel like it doesn't make sense. So whenever you're having characters talk about something with exposition in particular, ask yourself why they're saying those things. We will go more into this later with the dialogue section, but I felt it was important to mention while we're in the exposition section, because dialogue is a very good tool for exposition with things like this. And now we are going into magic. Hooray! First thing you want to look at is creating your rules. When you're making those, how they're going to work, make sure you don't put yourself into a corner with anything, see if there's something plot related that you're looking at, and you want to make sure it's going to work for you the way you need it to, all of that. The other thing is comparing different types of magic. Once again, I can't emphasize it enough. Everything's kind of been done before. You know, it's the 21st century, so nothing's perfectly original. And it doesn't need to be. It's perfectly fine for you to go through and say, I feel inspired by this kind of magic. I like this mechanic. I like that mechanic. And kind of bring everything together that you like about all the different types of magic you've experienced. Throw in some of your own ideas. And then come out with something that actually works in your story. Boots on the ground. Actually functions the way you need it to. That's perfectly fine. One of the main marketing things for most novels, you will find at some point a book that says, it's like this version of this story. The Magicians by Lev Grossman, which you should only read if you are in college. Well, of college age or higher. It's been said it's like Harry Potter for adults. That's one of the quotes they have used to sell the book. So it's perfectly fine for you to just directly parallel and call out, even, when something is a lot like something else. It's not an expectation within the literary community, or even readers necessarily, for your work to be completely 100% original and never have existed near anything else. I mean, for example, in the creation of Harry Potter, one of Rowling's interviews, she's like, I didn't read a lot of fantasy, so I avoided all the tropes. And we're like, no, anyone who has read fantasy knows she stepped on pretty much every single trope, which was fine, but to claim she did not because she was ignorant of the genre is not true. Granted, I have not read this interview in many years, and I am sure it is difficult to find at this point. But it is something that was mentioned, and not necessarily accurately. Following your rules, very important. When you make them, you have to stick with them. Remember that hurdles will make you more creative. It's really hard to think of it that way when you're in the moment and struggling against a barrier, but an obstacle in your story will make you be more creative in order to solve the problem. You won't go for the first thing you thought of. You'll go for what makes sense in that story. So, following your rules may be challenging, but it is very, very rewarding and often yields a better story. So, building your magic rules. This is when we're going to go into different types of magic. Now, I'm only mentioning 2. There are so many. But I'm only going to mention 2. 1 book, 1 movie, 1 show, and go from there. So, Harry Potter uses a lot of emotionally based magic with personalized instruments, the wands, because of the audience and plot it was catered to. It was catered to children and teenagers who are focusing on their identity and developing their individuality. So a wand that is just like you, it represents you and the way you are as a person, and spells that come from the heart are going to resonate with that audience. It's going to make a lot of sense because their individuality and identity is so important to them. So having it be important to the magic is going to connect with them. And then there's Supernatural, the TV show, which we'll pretend ended on like season 4. Uses a very resource-based, religious-themed magic because of the story tone and atmosphere. It's a little grittier. Things are a lot harder for them. You have a limitation on things. Your emotions aren't like limited, but you only have so much rock salt. So yes, the religious theme would be the equivalent of that's not necessarily limited, but there are things like if you're losing faith necessarily, it could be hard. It's the words that make it count, true, but if it's harder to say the words, you have that struggle. It's less high stakes with Harry Potter and more high stakes with Supernatural because there are real world restrictions on their magic and how you would use it. You have to get sigils right, and you have to get the shapes right, and if a strong breeze blows your protective circle apart, then you're in trouble. Like, it's to create more of that tension than you would necessarily find in Harry Potter, because teenagers and adults are looking for different things. More tension with an adult is going to be more compelling, whereas a teenager more or less is not looking for that much tension. They want some, but not as much. It shouldn't feel like they could potentially feasibly lose. Like, you generally know there's going to be a good ending if it's a young adult. Generally. So, point is, magic and its rules should be designed to fit the audience, the plot, and story themes. So if you're looking at loss, you're going to go with a more restrictive magic style. If you're looking at adults, you're going to want a more practical magic style. If you're looking at young adults, you're going to want something a little more fantastical, a little bit more optimistic, if you will. Depending. If you're going like post-apocalyptic, but young adult, things are going to be a bit more grim and you're going to have it be more restricted. So keep that in mind, how everything interacts with one another. These are general tips, and you might have to tweak them a bit depending on your genre, your story themes, and so forth. Now, comparing the rules of magic a little more closely. Harry Potter and Supernatural, keeping with those since we already talked about them, they are both ritualistically based. You have to say the words right, you have to get the gestures right, you have to get gestures for Harry Potter, shapes for Supernatural. There is a recipe to both. Versus, like, if you do it wrong in Supernatural, someone could die. If you do it wrong in Harry Potter, you're getting a D. Like, that's really how it goes. Your grade's gonna go down. They have a different grading system in Harry Potter. I don't know it off the top of my head. But the stakes aren't that high for, like, half the series. About. Now, you have the instrument required. This is something that's different for people with Harry Potter, different stories. With Harry Potter, you have a wand that is, like a long pen. It's not a big deal. But if you had something like other fantasy stories, Lord of the Rings, Dragon Age, something like that, your magic could be different. You need a staff, a full standing staff. Do you need it, or is it something that helps channel it? Those are your decisions. Then we have Supernatural, where it's religiously focused. You can have holy water and a Bible and be on your way. Some rock salt, you're done. But it's a bag of stuff rather than a single instrument. You don't necessarily need the instrument. When you have Supernatural, that's the different ingredients, making sure it is a literal recipe in this case. It is more like the potions class of Harry Potter, but all the time with everything. Versus Harry Potter, you do have specific things that are even more emotional than I've already covered. The Patronus Charm, for example, which is going to be catered to the caster. What your Patronus is is defined by you as a person. So it's specific to you. Supernatural doesn't really have anything like that. And ridiculous. Also, what a boggart is manifests as your personal fear. And ridiculous, the spell to cast away a boggart has to appeal to your sense of humor so that you aren't afraid. And it turns your fear into something funny. It's about emotions. Just to give you more of a look at what makes sense with each one. Now, following your rules goes back to that story handbook I had talked about earlier. You want to compose a list of norms and exceptions for your magic and stick to them. An exception coming out of nowhere in the nick of time is not a good look. You want to hint at things like that. Be like, no one's ever done that before. I think it was written down once somewhere, but everybody died anyway. Like, they did it, yeah, but it leveled a city building, like, or just a city, like, reverse that. Just a city building or a whole city. Create those kinds of things in advance. Foreshadow it. If you're going to make an exception to your rules, you must foreshadow it. Or rather, I would highly recommend it. I am sure there are people who have pulled it off without any foreshadowing, but I don't think it's a good idea. Because honestly, it's not going to come across good. It's going to look like you backed yourself in and didn't know how else to wow people, so you pulled this out of the air. Versus if you even give subtle hints leading up to it, no one has to have a conversation about it. It could be something noticed in passing. Think of Ruby's eye color in Ruby. RWBY by Rooster Teeth. It's something that was hinted at. I don't want to go too much into it for spoilers, but there is a special ability connected to her eye color. You may not have noticed these things because it's just her eye color, and it's not unheard of for people to have very strange eye or hair colors in fantasy genres. You might have overlooked it, but it was still there, and it doesn't feel as much like it was pulled out of thin air and just made up if it's been there the whole time, but you just didn't attribute any information to it as an audience member. That's something that works. But you should be able to have that list of norms and exceptions and stick to them so that this magic feels real. The less the reader is aware of your existence and interference in the story, the better off you will be. And in order to do that, you need to make your rules and stick to them. So absolutely make a list. When in doubt, put it in the list because you'll be happy for it later and not have to be in the middle of chapter 17 going, can you levitate that? You'll want it written down somewhere, the biggest thing you've levitated versus the smallest thing you've levitated, and how much energy it would take, and so forth. Having all that written down saves you a lot of hassle. Granted, things like this will happen from time to time anyway, but having it written means it happens less often to you, and you are not going to have to do as much research in the moment, and going to stick to your rules much better. Similarly, knowing your abilities and impossibilities. What is truly, genuinely impossible? There should be something that's impossible. A whole sphere of things that's just not doable. I know that seems weird with magic, but it's things like radios don't work at Hogwarts. It just doesn't. It just does not. The end. Versus casting without speaking. Not possible. You can make potions, but you can't cast a spell without talking. Only in the Harry Potter movie there's a guy in Hogsmeade who's stirring his drink with his finger, telepathically stirring the spoon inside the mug with his finger. So he doesn't have a wand and he's not talking. He's reading, but he's doing magic. So, impossible and impossible. You have to know. Is it impossible? As in the story, no one's tried it and therefore it's impossible? Or does it truly never happen? Boom. Radios don't work on Hogwarts. Boom. Done. That's impossible. It'll never work. Radios don't work near magic. The end. Having things that are off limits for magical elements makes it feel more real. And knowing your abilities will also help you with substituting things like it would be silly for Hermione to not fix Harry's glasses because she knows a spell that will fix them. But he used tape. because he didn't know it. You, as the author, know it, and Hermione knows it. This way, you're not pulling a Harry and using something that maybe there's a better solution for, except you know it. It gets a little awkward when a character does have a faster solution to something and they do it the long way. And it's not even acknowledged in the story. If you acknowledge it, it's different. So, knowing those abilities will also help you acknowledge it when someone's not using it and should. And know those things so that you don't fall into that trap yourself. Very, very important is this last bullet here to remember it. Do not ever forcibly magic your way out of a situation. If you have backed yourself into a corner in a plot, you would have just got to find another way. Because as soon as you use magic to force your way out of that situation, you will lose so many people following your story. Because now it's just, you're going to just break whatever you need to in order to get out of the hole that you've created. At that point, you're going to have to run with what you've caused, what situation you've set up, and just go with it and find another way out of it. Because as soon as you break your rules to make things more convenient for you, you have just completely destroyed that willing suspension of disbelief. They have been buying into these rules, and then you break them. Now everything's fair game, and nothing's impossible, and the writer's going to do whatever they want to make the story work. They're on their way. So, never, ever use magic to get yourself out of a bind. Not a good idea. Ooh, another important message with abilities and impossibilities. I forgot to mention stigmas. Think of something like necromancy. There's usually a stigma on necromancy and dark magics in most fantasy realms. Things that aren't impossible, but are taboo. So, very important to mention. Now, we have building your party. I'm stopping for tea. Here, my dragon-aged cup. You can't see it. There it is. Anyway, Purple Hawk's my favorite, now you know. At the mention of building your party, I always think of Dragon Age. Anywho, we have our archetypes. Your warrior, generic warrior, fighter monk, your warrior woman. These are just that. Your shifty little thief, the sweet healer, the more recent subversion, super tired, cranky healer. Archetypes. It's fine to use those. They're great plot tools. Then balancing your party, and just a few examples to give you an idea of what I'm talking about with balancing it out and using archetypes. So, more into those fantasy archetypes, the short ones I'd mentioned before. We have the warriors, as you can tell from the fact that I mentioned like 3 of them off the top of my head. They're among my favorites. Having them there is useful not only for people who are more physical and will just rush ahead, generally speaking, and kind of go in the moment and are generally more intuitive as people. They're helpful for when you need action now. Or, a problem now. Either one. There are certainly people who are warriors that are careful thinkers or quick thinkers. And they're very good at just charging in and doing what needs to be done. Some of them are a little more intuitive and they might do things that they shouldn't have done because they rushed into it. So, useful to have, but know their strengths and weaknesses and balance it out with the rest of your party. These are just some examples. The main ones, there are certainly ones that are not on this list. For example, thieves, rogues, not on this list anywhere. But certainly very essential. You can run into them anywhere. They could be a supporting cast, they could be a faceless character, they could be your main character. You have your bard types, which are usually non-combative. They usually talk their way in and out of things, sometimes simultaneously. They get themselves in trouble, out of trouble, and then back into it inside of 2 minutes. You don't know. Now, this character, I would say, is usually either supported by a large cast or accompanying the main cast, kind of bolstering them when you need someone to have connections on their behalf. That's where you would use a bard. 9 times out of 10, bard type. The Yaskiers and Dandelions of the world of Witcher fame. Then you have your battle mages, people who are magic users, yes, but fighters. So they could technically rival a warrior, they're just perhaps a little back. They might also have the appearance of a warrior, but be a battle mage. That's another option, that they don't generally use magic first and foremost, or they use it until people get too close and then they switch. Definitely an option. So keep it in mind with a battle mage. They're very fun ways to go about having magic people who don't necessarily look like your typical bathrobe wearing stickish sort of mage. You can get around things like that. The healer, of course, more or less essential in fantasy games in particular, and extremely handy to have in fantasy stories, because people presumably are going to get hurt, and patching them up believably can be one of your biggest hurdles. If you go without a healer for a while, it's also very good to emphasize the difference once you have one. So you can have a more dismal moment where trying to heal yourself is extremely difficult, to making a healer connection and knowing someone who can heal you, who travels with you, and makes that easier both on the writer and makes the story feel a little lighter to the readers as well. What I've affectionately called the kind of a big deal. Your princes, queens, surprise nobles, villain's son, or daughter, twins. Whoever they are, they're kind of a big deal. And you kind of get that impression too, but you don't necessarily know it. You may not. It could be an escort mission where it's like, this is Prince Princeton. He's Princey. Take him somewhere safely. Or it could be like, yeah, my name's Mike. Yeah, my name's Mike. I am not important. And you're like, you're still wearing your crown, man. It could be something that's a secret, badly kept, or well kept. Who knows? The kind of a big deal role. It's a good development sort of plot point if they know who they are and they get to kind of learn more as they go through this whole quest, if you will. Or it's a good plot twist if they don't know that they're kind of a big deal and they find out later. In cases like being the villain's child, the antagonist's child, it's going to be a problem later because they didn't think you were connected and you were, and you hid it. Why? Some people might be like, yeah, that makes sense. I would hide it too if Ganon was my dad. I would probably just not talk about being Ganondorf's kid. I'd leave it out. I get it. Or it could be people who are livid, how could you not tell me? We're gonna go kill him, and it's no surprise that we got the one-up on us in the last temple, because apparently you've been informing him all along, even if you haven't. Even if that one-up wasn't even you. It's very good red herring, too, if there is a traitor in the midst, but it's not the person who's kind of a big deal. So, definitely fun to play with, especially if you have kind of a plot twist planned. And then your tried and true chosen one. Obviously, people have been subverting this for a while now, going with chosen ones who don't want to be, going with, a case of mistaken identity, going up with, backup chosen ones. Think, Wind Waker, for example, where the world kind of fell apart because, the last Link was just I think I'll go to Starbucks. Just didn't. Just did not. It was meh, fighting, oof, sounds bad. Oof, don't like that, and just didn't go. So, there's a lot of different ways you can look at that. As again, there are more archetypes than I could possibly list here. The list is massive. But these are ones that I've found are fairly useful and modern-ish. So, you can have a more well-received story, if you will. If you're looking at something that's going to take off fairly well and be enjoyable for other people, sticking with archetypes that are kind of newer will help freshen up some of the more classic ones that you'll most likely be using. That way you're getting the best of both worlds. You have the stuff that they always love and something a little new to bring to the table, so it's not just a recolor of an existing character, but a story. And now, important for you as writers is to balance out your party. It's not a video game, I know, but if you have a team of 7 mages on foot and they're all fighting, like, you will run out of words for the word spell and cast. You're gonna have to come up with everyone's unique casting style so that it all feels different in a combative situation. No one's on the front lines, so they're all on the front lines. Someone is going to get murdered, especially if they're all the bathrobe wearing type mage. No one here actually has any armor, metal plating armor. They have leather armor at most. They just kind of expected no one was going to get that close. 7 mages could ambush people, but they might also get ambushed, and if they do, they're probably dead. Like, definitely you're going to lose at least 2 people before any shields can come up. So, you want to make sure you balance out your party for word choice reasons, for describing the scenes. You want to make sure you don't have too much of the same type of person in the area of your main cast. So you'll have, a mage or 2. 2 of one class is fine. So you have your thieves and your mages, you have your squishy little nobles, warriors. Make sure that whoever's in your central cast, there aren't too many of them crammed in there. As much as all of us generally will find a favorite class and stick with it, it doesn't generally work in a written group. And you can make exceptions for the plot. So, for example, something like your expert thief is in the party and they've been amazing and incredible, and then another thief comes along and they're better, and everyone likes them, and they're like, wow, they're super cool, and the implication is that you aren't as cool now. That could be a plot point. It's possible, especially if it's an escort mission. Also, the person you're escorting is better at this than you are. Like, it is a great way to have a plot event going, but also to challenge a character in the party with someone who's not normally in the main party, if you will. So if you were escorting a prince, for example, and he's more charismatic than your existing bard, there you go. You have conflict arising from this. One person is going to try to prove themselves more. Is this prince arrogant? Are they just pleased that they're able to do anything after they've been locked up all their lives? Like, maybe they've been very sheltered, and they were afraid they'd be this useless sack of stupid, so this is a good moment for them. I don't know. That's something you would have to work out in your story. So you can make exceptions for the plot, but make it brief. Something like an escort mission has an ending, inevitably. Another way you can get people out of your party is to kill them in the course of the story. It depends on what kind of story you're writing. Now, I keep mentioning Legend of Zelda because I love it. So, examples of a well-rounded, balanced party, they don't always have to be in the same group. That's the important part of Triforce Trio, is that one of them is the antagonist. Ganon is shredded. He has an 8-pack. The tea is not helping. Anyway, but it's delicious. Ganon is shredded. He's absolutely the muscle. He is the tank of this group. Link is more Leith, dancer's build, swimmer's build. He's got muscle. It's just he's not shredded. So he can fight. But he's more of a well-rounded, middle ground sort of fighter. And Zelda's more stealth and magic, chic. But also launching a fireball at your face in Super Smash. Like, she's more on that side. So each of them has their own forte, their own thing that they're good at. Honestly, I would say Ocarina of Time is the best example of this because they each all have their own different levels of knowledge as well. So, like Link, who knows nothing about the legends in his world, versus Ganon, who knows a good deal of it, and Zelda, who knows all of it. Has been taught it by the people who have been documenting it forever. So, you have a very good example there of not just different archetypes, but different levels of knowledge that they're bringing to the table. It's a very well-rounded trio. As you can tell, they've worked on it for quite a while. They're still making money. So, other group is Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I wanted to pick groups of different sizes, because while the rule of 3 is certainly a thing, there's always your triad. It's a very comfy, familiar fantasy group size. You can go up to 4 or 5. I would think with like 5, look at like Kipo, where the group can expand to 5 or 6 people, but it's usually 4. Kipo, if you haven't watched it, very good TV show. On Netflix, I believe. In any case, that's an example of a fantasy story where you can change your group size. Your main group is usually 4, but can grow. And they interact well with one another. But Narnia is one of your classics with the 4 siblings. It works in books, it works in movies. You've got Lucy, who's brave and trusting. Edmund is a brat and generally unfriendly, so when his redemption arc comes through, it works out. This doesn't, it's not 4 siblings getting along perfectly. It's pretty skeptical. We'd all be pretty skeptical of that. There's Susan, who's very practical and kind. And then there's Peter, the natural leader and peacekeeper, oldest sibling. So you have your 4, and they balance one another out very, very well. Both in personality and then in abilities later on as they become the different rulers of Narnia. Now, Game of Thrones is the example that I will give because there's a billion characters in this story. There's trees, and this person's that person's cousin's sister's boyfriend's best friend. Like, it's a sprawling cast, and if you aren't super used to writing very large casts, I would avoid things like this, but it is possible, and you can do it well. George R.R. Martin does an excellent job incorporating all these different characters and not necessarily making it feel like these characters just come out of nowhere when there's someone perfectly good for the role literally right there. Like, it happens once in a while, but it's not constant. Generally speaking, having the different characters come up when they do doesn't always feel like they don't need to be there, and there was someone who is better for the job that has been left on the table. The books, I should say. The TV show does leave out a lot of people who would be good at it, or misrepresent people to fit their agenda, so it can be a little dissonant if you've read the book, and then go to watch the TV show. It can be a lot dissonant, but generally I would say you want to keep your group size to the 3 to 5 range, maybe 7 if you feel that you need it. But make sure you have objectives in mind for these characters. What is their purpose? Where are you going with them? How involved do you expect them to be? And always keep a list. That way, when you have a list of the characters you've already made, when the time comes for you to go, I need someone to do this. I need someone to cause this event, to set off this event. Who would do something that would cause this? You can go, I don't know, let's go back to this person I mentioned in chapter 3 and never brought up again. You can look through your list and say, oh, it actually is really cool for that person to come back out of nowhere after not being mentioned for a while and attribute things to them from previous chapters, and it starts feeling like coming together more instead of creating an entirely new person. You're gonna have to go through different things like that. Now, fantasy dialogue. Very tricky. For exposition reasons. I did mention it earlier, and now we're coming back to it. So, I start first with things to ask yourself. It's dialogue basic. Just make sure your dialogue sounds good from a general standpoint. The implications of your dialogue and avoiding exposition dumps. With fantasy stories in particular, this is so important. So, I want to make sure I emphasize that right out of the gate. Now, when you're making dialogue, in general, you need to ask yourself, does it read well? If you can't wrap your mind around what's being said, it's not helping. Would I actually say this? This is so important with fantasy in particular. There are a lot of games in the Tales of series with dialogue that is just sad. I wouldn't say there's a lot, but there are a few, and their dialogue is truly bad. No one would actually say those things. Ever. So, that's something that's important. It does happen in fantasy with a somewhat more alarming frequency than in other genres, so all the fantasy stories you know and love, you might come across things like this more often there than elsewhere. Third question, what is this dialogue saying about the character? Sometimes it could be nothing, but I personally doubt it. I mean, even just greeting someone, how you say hello to a person will say something about you. If you go, heyo, or sup, or just look, or you say greetings, or salutations. Even if you just looked at someone and then bowed your head a little bit and said, Your Majesty, it tells you something about both the person and the person about they're talking to. Which brings us to number 4. What does this dialogue tell the audience? And the ever essential, I'm never going to let it go, is this an exposition dump? Now, first thing is, does it read well? Now, the thing you really want to know with this is word count. It's okay to have characters ramble from time to time, but it still needs to read and flow well. And the one thing I will always recommend is reading your dialogue aloud. Just so if you're tumbling over your words in a way that's making it actually hard to say, it probably doesn't read well either in your head. So, if you can say it and it flows well enough, and not with practice, then you're good. But if you are stumbling over your words just trying to say it, it's probably not a good line of dialogue because it's something that's hard to say. And it's tricky when you're writing because you have all kinds of time to think about writing it perfectly. But when you're speaking, it's live. You don't have the kind of time to process and think. So sometimes you end up with dialogue that ends up a little stiff and unnatural for how people would actually sound. So you want to weed out words you don't need and make it feel more natural when you do read it. So this first example sentence I have here is, I can already tell she's going to be a problem brother. Now, we're leaving the brother there because maybe that's something this person is like. They're referring to this person and how they relate to them. This is Carver from Dragon Age will say brother or sister fairly often because you can rename Hawk in Dragon Age 2. So there may be reasons for things like this. Obviously, this wouldn't apply in a book. You wouldn't be naming your character necessarily, but there could be a reason that someone is using brother or sister. It's feasible. Now, first thing you want to clean up is I can already tell. With a sentence like this, you don't necessarily need it. By saying what you think is going to be an issue with this person, you're already showing that you can tell this is going to be a problem. Just by observing it aloud. So you can get rid of I can already tell. While it could be something you might say face to face with someone, it does reduce the impact of the dialogue because there's more words that don't really contribute to the meaning at all. So, every extra word you use that doesn't actually bring anything to the dialogue reduces the impact of that dialogue. So we have, she is going to be a problem brother. A little more to the point, you can kind of feel the weight of it more. Of I'm warning you now, this is going to be an issue. And if you don't listen to me, I'm going to say I told you so. But you still have is going to be. It's long. So we end up with she will be a problem brother. You can almost see the discussion between this guy and this girl, and she takes off, and the person, that guy's sibling, is right there going, she will be a problem brother. You can feel that. Already. Just a little bit, a little tweaking, and it's worked. And now if you had a more casual character, you could have them just be like, well, quite a handful, huh? Doesn't have to be formal like this. But generally making sure that every word is pulling its weight, has a presence and purpose in that sentence, is going to help. So, for example, with the casual one, when I said quite a handful, huh? you would think is kind of just a filler sound, but it covers the casualness of the speaker. That's the kind of person they are. So it does have a purpose. It gets to stay. Similar things happen with like, like all that. These are words that contribute to the understanding of this character, maybe not the meaning of the sentence specifically or the message they're trying to convey. That's character establishment and exposition in its own right. So if you take it out, this character starts losing a bit of their character. You want to make sure you keep things in there that don't necessarily have a strict, straightforward meaning, but are still doing something. Hence why each word has a purpose, not necessarily contributing to the meaning of the message. Now, this one's so important. Would I say this? If you find yourself embarrassed to read this aloud to yourself, odds are you're writing about something you haven't written about before, or no one would ever actually say this with a straight face. Like, just not going to be a thing. This could be something where your character's more comfortable with things than you are. You got to take some of it in context, but this is really, really important to keep in mind to prevent your characters from saying things like, "You haven't seen the things that I've seen," which is a generic phrase that could apply to literally anyone talking to literally anyone. Like, it doesn't sound like a single person saying it. It doesn't sound like it's covering an event that was specific. It's just kind of this vague, weird sentence. So, it sounds more dramatic, especially if you shout it and act like you said something really deeply impactful when you didn't. Those are the kinds of things you want to avoid. The awkward sentences that you cannot possibly fathom saying. Now, these quotes that I'm listing here are things that may feel absurd or weighty or silly, but make sense, would be said. Just to give you an example of things that hit different tones, but actually make sense to be spoken. You could see someone saying these things. So we have Terry Good, Soul of the Fire quote here, but this was no ordinary chicken. This chicken was evil manifest. That's something you could picture someone saying, and it does convey both the nature of this chicken and the nature of the speaker. If no one is thinking about cuckoos right now from Legend of Zelda, I'll be amazed. Are they not evil manifest? I feel like they are. Then we have a quote here from Missing Wings, and covers the end of a discussion, to avoid spoilers, but it says, "It's not the answer you wanted to hear," Fa said. "It's the truth," Katrina said, stepping onto the walk leading to the back door. "The truth's better than hearing nothing." So you have an idea of what just happened. This dialogue isn't necessarily mind-blowing. It's not going to revolutionize your understanding of weighty discussions, but it does feel genuine. And there's meaning behind the sentences that isn't being said. It's not the answer you wanted to hear could be said irritably, as in like, "I tried to warn you away from this," or it could be said out of concern, "Are you alright? This isn't what you wanted. Are you okay?" Then we have Katrina answering, perhaps resigned, perhaps hopeful. "It's the truth, and the truth is better than hearing nothing." So, at this point, you can assume Katrina has not known what happened, not known this answer, and it has been tormenting her. And now she knows, and even if it's not what she wanted, it's the truth. So she's not necessarily saying, "I'm okay," but "I will be." It's important to mention things like that. So, I guess I will change way before I get to the last one. Here we are. "If you see the dragon fly, best you drink the flagon dry." Now, this is from someone being quoted within a quote, but the point is, you know that whoever is quoting this, the culture they're from potentially, kind of is like, well, things have gone sideways, better clear out the kegs. Just, you know that dragons are a thing, and that the response to them is usually like, well, there goes my Tuesday, like, it's over. That's how you would go about that. So, this feels like something someone would say. It feels like something you could hear possibly or see on a plaque in like a tavern. It feels realistic, and it tells you about the world, what they're up against, and what they have to fight against those things. Some unhealthy coping mechanisms, maybe. Now, we'll go to the side that I accidentally showed you earlier. What does this dialogue say? Firstly, about the character, much like how what you say reflects on you, your character's dialogue leaves an impression on the readers. So, the one example I gave here from The Eye of the World is, death is lighter than a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. So this is a person who is like, death isn't a problem for me. It's living up to my duty. That is the more serious thing. They place value on that. And I mean, at this point, it sounds like they're daunted by it a little. Living up to their duty is something that means more to them than preserving their life. That's something. It's definitely something. So, and it's not a lot of words. It doesn't take a lot to express this. This is something that is implied, that a reader can perceive because they've talked to people. They understand these words and what they mean together in this order. It's important not to get too much into treating like your readers like they won't understand things. Give them the chance to interpret things themselves, and they get more immersed in the world. You don't want to leave them in the dark. You want to give them enough to go on, but you don't have to, like, spoon feed it. If this person straight up said, like, I would rather die than neglect my duty, it doesn't mean as much as death is lighter than a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. Because it gives you that chance to soak it up and think about it and realize what they mean without them having to expressly say it. So, that's how you would use something to explain more about your character and their values without expressly coming out and saying it. Another thing that dialogue is for is exposition, once again. Because you can explain things about the story and the world and the state of things based on how the characters talk. So, it's more than just making your character's personality and opinions known, although your opinions of your cast can explain the conditions of the story. Using Dragon Age as an example again, if you ever have Fenris and Anders in your party, and the subject of mages comes up, you will see what I mean. Fenris hates them. Anders wants to free them. And their opinions will always be at odds. That's how it is. The quote I chose here, though, is from Talisman of El, where it says, "Mortals cannot perceive me with the physical eye whilst in my pure form, unless it is of my choosing, for it would result in fatality, which begs the question of why you are an exception." So, this is obviously some kind of weird supernatural entity, which could explain the clunkiness of the dialogue. That's fair. Because they're, your supernatural entities tend to speak a bit fancy, and maybe less naturally than their mortal peers. It explains that mortals typically can't see them with the physical eye unless they choose to, that they are in their pure form at the moment, have not chosen to be seen. This should have killed the seer. And, even this entity does not know why the mortal can see them without it of their choosing. So this is explained, all of that, in comparably much smaller dialogue. So you know some rules, and they have been loosely outlined to you. And as an author, when you wrote this, you would step to the side to say, mortals can't perceive this entity with the physical eye in its pure form. They can see it in these forms, or if the entity chooses to do so, if they do see it, it will kill them, except for this person. And then author-only knowledge for the time being, one would assume, is why they can see this creature and not die, but not have been permitted to see this creature to start with. And then the readers can find that out over the course of the story, or maybe not, who knows. That really depends on what the plot line is about. I have not a Talisman of El. Okay, so with Exposition Dump, huge thing that you want to be worried about. So, particularly risky in fantasy stories. You're going to come across this in a lot of different ways, especially if you have a lot of things you've made up. So, things you want to watch out for more than anything, I find, is nations and landmarks, things like that. You'll notice when you read a lot of fantasy books, when you open them up, there's usually a map on the inside. This is because it's just too hard to explain geography in exposition, in description, in dialogue, without it sounding really, really stupid. So, for example, if I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go to Maine this weekend. It's like an hour and a half drive and it's northeast and there's like this coastline. Yeah, no, it shares a border with New Hampshire. Yeah, that's what I was going to do this weekend. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to have to drive through these really thick woods and there's like moose and everything. Like, it's really weird for me to be explaining this much to someone who also knows this. Like, there's no reason. There's no reason for me to be going into this much detail. And similarly, general common knowledge. For the most part, you're not going to have people giving that out. Get that out of here. Sorry about that. General common knowledge. Not a whole lot of reason for you to be saying things like that. Unless you're trying to imply something like the speaker thinks the person they're talking to is an idiot. Like, that's the only reason that someone would tell someone else general common knowledge. Like, walk up to a door and someone's been pulling on it and you're like, it's push. It's push door. Like, that kind of situation, yes, you would be obviously sharing common knowledge. Or being sarcastic, like, did you know that in order for the car to move, you've got to turn it on? Wow. Like, that real world equivalent, but fantasy. So you could be like, in order to get the carriage, we have to have horses pull it? We have to move it, we have to have horses to pull it. Wow. I didn't know that. Did you know that, Kevin? Like, throwing real shade at Kevin. I don't know what he did. Screwed up, I'm guessing. But that's the only reason you would be using, like, general common knowledge. And it can be used for things that are fantasy elements. So, if you have a magical device that is powered by an element in the world, you can use that horse carriage sarcasm to explain it to someone, and they can be like, yeah, shut up. You can use that sarcastic exchange to get general common knowledge out there in a way that feels natural and not like you just shoehorned it in there because you needed the readers to know. So, here are other questions you can use to avoid exposition dumps. First being, why are these characters discussing this? If it doesn't make sense, if they're doing it just because you need that information out there, if the answer is ever, well, I need it to be told to the readers. When the writer says, I need it to happen, and that's the reason it's happening, you've got a problem. And how long have they been talking? As much as dialogue can work in long periods of time, it doesn't always. So you're going to want to be careful with things like that. If a discussion's been going on for a really, really long time and it is all information that you need conveyed, it's too long. It's just too long. Especially if it's all talking. If it's just one person telling another, you're going to run out of clarifying questions to ask. You got to find other ways to tell them. Anything that they can observe, anything they can see for themselves, you'll want to use that instead. It's not that no one can have a discussion, it's that you don't want it to go for, like, 4 chapters. Doesn't really work as well. Alright, and now I will be going with final questions. If you have missed the live panel, you can always send them to the channel for this specific presentation, and I will be happy to answer them after the fact. For those of you who have been present and sending questions, thank you very much. I'm very happy to help. If you think of others later, the offer is open to you as well. I will be uploading my panel presentation to my YouTube page, but also uploading it to my website, jamblute.com, and you can find me on all the various social media platforms listed down there. I will most likely be posting the videos there as well. They're usually staggered from one another, so it will be probably a little more convenient for you to start here and be able to go from there. Any questions that I have had written down, I will include on my website at jamblute.com with the video as well. So you can have the questions in the video all in one place. Anything else, you can absolutely reach out. I'm always happy to talk nerd stuff and writing stuff, and I hope you have a fantastic fair.